Cultivate our thoughts. Like I said, we'll get into the last line of the noble of the straw man position. We began to look at that on Tuesday, and there are three main subpoints, and I wanted to kind of expand on that relative to what Paul went through in Acts chapter 23, 24, and 25, where Paul had to address three people while he was under the Augustan Claudius Caesar emperorship. He had to deal with one Felix, as we'll see. He had to deal with one Festus, as we shall also see. And then he had to deal with Agrippa. All of these men are rulers. One of them is Jewish. Who was that? Agrippa. Herod Agrippa, the son of Herod the Great. And so the Herods were the ones who killed. So these would be men who were direct proponents to the killing of the two witnesses that are in Revelation chapter 11, if you guys remember that account, the two witnesses. And you and I know that because it was the beast that came up out of the bottomless pit that we saw also in Revelation chapter 12. So when we think about Agrippa, we think about a beast. And that's why I said in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul said, I labored with beasts at Ephesus. And he wasn't talking literal beast, although the Christians did often find themselves facing the beasts in the auditorium under Nero all the way through Domitian. What I want to do is just read a narrative for you. You may begin to appreciate it in the context of debates, and particularly in the context of a straw man argument, where the Apostle Paul was indicted and accused by his accusers of things that were not true. And you'll see every fallacy that we began to look at last Tuesday: genetic fallacy, slippery slope arguments, overgeneralization, particularly ad hominems, and then one of the more egregious crimes committed. When you raise an accusation against someone, you at least should face that person so that you demonstrate the integrity of your allegation by being present. And that was one of the things that did not occur. So I'm going to read through chapter 24 and then make some observations about how Paul had to deal with all of this ignoble accusations that came against him. And then, like I said, I'll leave room for some Q&A as well. I'm in chapter 24, verse 1. And after 5 days, Ananias the high priest descended with the elders and with a certain orator named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul. Now, the governor here in this context is who? Felix. And when he was called forth, Tertullus began accusing Paul. So if you want to contextualize it, understand the subject in view. So this is really a court case, okay? And this is what we meant with or apologetics. Classical, clean debate between two adversaries. It was defending the gospel. So Paul is in a apologetic setting right now. Does that follow? He's in a defense of the cause of the gospel right now. And the high priest is accusing him. And they have hired an excellent orator, of which Paul said in 1 Corinthians 3 that he was not one of them, because excellent orators are designed to sway you by their smooth speech, by their sophisticated reasoning, by their ability to manipulate their eloquence. Was called for, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness. Notice what he's doing. And that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence. Now, what is Tertullus doing here that God's word says no ruler should succumb to? Flattery. Flattery. He says in the law that you and I are to avoid flattery, because flattery does what? It works ruin. It will cause you to take a bribe. And so apparently in this context, what the high priest was not confident about, as we're going to see, is that he could face Paul without an excellent orator. He needed someone that would begin to massage the ego of the judge, who in this context is Felix. Don't want you to miss that, because that's the beauty of the scripture. It's just beautiful. Look at verse 3. We accepted always, this is Tertullus talking, and in all places, most noble Felix. Do you see it? Most noble Felix, with all thankfulness, notwithstanding that I be not further tedious unto thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of thy clemency a few words. Now there you go, just the framing of words to get at sort of the emotional heartstrings of the leader. Y'all got that, right? Here we go. For we have found this man a pestilent what? So again, as we are working through modes of speech and dealing with heart matters, you notice that as Tertullus is representing the high priest, he's speaking well of the ruler, and immediately he attacks Paul. Now, where we were talking about what is the liability of straw man, we get down to the lower end where we talk about genetic fallacies, slippery slopes, overgeneralizations. Would that third category there fit what's happening now? What's the third category in under subpoint D? Genetic fallacies, I'll talk about that. Slippery slopes, these are false assertions of where a person is going with their position when there's no grounds to justify the argument that they may go that way. And then the next one is what? Overgeneralization. Do you guys have the same outline I do? All right, overgeneralization. When you're overgeneralizing, it just means you're not ready for the debate. But then the fourth one is what, you guys? Ad hominem. Ad hominem. Now, what is ad hominem? What does that mean? Just speak up loud because we can't hear you. It's it's arguing against their person or character and not addressing the particular subject. Does somebody have another way of defining it? So when you do an ad hominem, you're going after the person and not the topic. Does that make sense? Very important, okay? Now that is a tactic that works in the non-formal mode of debate. Most people in the practical general discourse of life, your friends and your loved ones, when they want to sway you to a position, they will use that fallacy. You guys know that. Ad hominems. Now, the problem with an ad hominem is that an ad hominem does not necessarily comport with the objective proposition that's in view. It does not negate it nor affirm it. So like a person can be a scoundrel, I mean an absolute scoundrel, and yet what they said or did could be true and be right. Does that make some sense? Right. I mean, if the scoundrel said the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, just because he's a scoundrel doesn't mean what he said was wrong. Does that make sense? All right, so I'll leave it like that because notice the way, good, I love this, unprovable inferences, logical fallacies, character flaws. Okay, did I write all that? Okay, good, great. I'm glad y'all caught all that because I don't even have that in my notes. But when you look at what Tertullus does over in verse 5, he opens up with a very scurrilous attack on Paul. He's a pestilent fellow. Well, I know in the 21st century, we don't even know what that means, but it just feels like something nasty, right? Like he's not even human, right? He's a pestilent fellow. So the idea is he goes around bugging people, creating problems, mental diseases, or what have you, creating hassles. What a bad way to frame it. But of course, these are lessons for you and me as to what the early church had to deal with. And this didn't stop in the apostolic era, by the way. This continued throughout church history and does today, even in our own world. Notice what it says, and he's a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarene. Now, looking at verse 5, what I want to say about the way that a person who is an ignoble debater or accuser, and they are two sides of the same coin, will be, is that they will often use half-truths. And this is where the Christian has to know how to separate the baby from the bathwater when there is narrative discourse or conflict scenarios occurring. It would be partially true that we have found him to be a kind of mover of sedition. I would reframe that. I would say also among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the what? Of the Nazarenes. That could be true if your position is that of a Pharisee under the law of Moses. If you're holding a legal position under the Mosaic law, when you understand the assertions of the gospel relative to Judaism, you could see how that what's happening with apostolic doctrine from Acts chapter 2 is that they are drawing away people to themselves under the auspices of a sectarian leader named Jesus. So you guys know what a sect is, right? A sect is a cut away group, a group cut out of a former setting. So what I'm trying to show you here is that terms have equivocating meaning. They can mean something positive in one context, and they can mean something negative in another context. Paul will affirm that the way that you call heresy, I worship the God of my fathers. In other words, he's owning the charge of being part of a sectarian movement. All right, so you have to know that, because even to today, Judaism utterly despises the gospel at the theological level, at the historical level, even at the ad hominem level. If anybody has real close relationships with like hyper Orthodox Jews, they don't have any love for Jesus. You would find them having a lot of scurrilous things to say about our Messiah. So I'm just letting you know, this is not unusual language that you're hearing here that the high priest is rendering. It's true. So he is a mover of sedition among the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Would Paul be a ringleader? Would he be one of the prominent proponents of the sect of the Nazarenes? Of course he would be. I did some of the historical backdrop on where we are now. Paul is somewhere like 13 years into his calling here in Acts chapter 23. He's 13 years down the line. Do you know what that means? We're into Acts chapter 23. We're headed to Acts chapter 28, are we not? We're not going backwards. That means we're past Ephesus. We're past Corinth. We're past Thessalonica, aren't we? We're past all of the Gentile churches that came up under Paul's teaching. That means everybody now knows how influential Pauline doctrine was in drawing Jews and Gentiles to Christ. It's only being framed as an ugly thing by those who are yet Judaizers. Does that make some sense? Just want you to get a context. Tertullus is not just pulling stuff out of thin air. Paul has been notorious since Acts chapter 9, particularly among the Jews, who back in Acts chapter 20 or 21, we'll look at that in a moment, they made vows to kill him. 40 men committed vows to kill Paul. That's how influential he was in all the synagogues of all of Asia Minor. You guys know that. So what this does is it gives you insight into the real tribulation Paul went through when he preached the gospel. So let's go on a little bit more. So we read further, verse 6, who also hath gone about to profane the temple, there it is, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. Now they caught him back in Acts 19, and he escaped. We'll be looking at a little bit of that. Would have judged him according to the law. But the chief captain, Lysias, came upon us and with great violence took him away out of our hands. Like the chief captain is a Roman centurion who used a band of soldiers to deliver Paul from the Jews because they had suborned to lie to them that they wanted to investigate Paul the next day, but they had swore to kill him. And Paul's his sister's son, so that would have been a nephew, came and told the captain what was happening, and the captain delivered him out of their hand. And notice the way that Tertullus has put it. He violently took Paul out of our hands. What would we say theologically? That God delivered Paul. That the sovereignty of God moved the magistrate to hear his nephew and thus deliver God's servant from the beast. Otherwise, the beast would have gotten Paul. Paul would have been the third witness they got. Or the fourth one, because who literally was the third one? How many of you guys know? Stephen. Stephen was the third one. Is that true? Right. Paul would have been taken at that time. But what did Jesus say in Acts chapter 9? Paul, I have many things to say through you to the Gentiles and to the rulers. You must suffer many things for my name's sake, right? And so he's suffering now, but he's being delivered providentially through all of this. It goes on to say, commanding his accusers to come unto thee. Now look at verse 8, because I want you to see that. We're going to go back there a minute. This is going to get back into noble debating. But the chief captain Lysias came upon us and with great violence took him away out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come unto you, Felix, by examining of whom thyself mayest take knowledge of all these things, whereof what? We accuse him. Now I want you to snapshot that. The chief captain of the Roman soldiers said that the Jews needed to bring the accusers to Paul face to face at the hearing of Felix in order for this to be adjudicated. Is that the right thing to do? That's what you guys have been learning all week long for the last 2 or 3 weeks. If you have an ought against someone, you face them. That is Jewish jurisprudence. And then when you have to take it to the highest courts, you come before the one you're raising the accusation and bring your argument before the magistrates. Right? Do you think they're going to show up? Watch. Watch how this goes. All this hoopla they were making. Watch how this goes. So the captain of the Roman army said, you got to show up in front of Felix. Now, who knows why the captain of the Roman army said that? Because Paul is a Roman of the Sicilian culture. And once the captain knew that, he realized he didn't have any wiggle room for being unjust with Paul, because he would have had to answer that from Caesar. That's why Paul appealed to Rome when the Jews wanted to kill him the first time. You guys keeping up? All right, so now notice what it goes on to say. Commanding his accuser to come to thee by examining whom thyself mayest take knowledge of all these things whereof we accuse him. And the Jews who also assented, saying that these things were so. Then Paul, after that, the governor had beckoned unto him to speak. So now the governor is letting Paul speak. You guys know that, right? He answered, for as much as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully what? Answer for myself. So you see how the protocol is working out. You have an accuser who makes an accusation. That accusation against the one accused merits the one accused an opportunity to speak for himself. Does that make sense? Right. This is what we mean by apologia, to answer again. To answer again. When we read for 1 Peter 3:15, render unto every man an answer of the hope. To give an answer is to respond again. So your job and mine is not on the offensive, it's on the what? Defense. It's on the defense. So Paul is about to defend his claims. And he says, I'm here cheerfully to do so. What an attitude. So now, here you are having to be attacked by all of these beasts from the religious system. Could it get to your head? Could it impact you emotionally? Could it disrupt you to the point that now that you're in front of the Roman court, because that's a beast too, you're just like Christ. You're dealing with beast 1 and beast 2. Y'all keeping up with me? Like, you could be very much like, you could be completely discombobulated. But notice what Paul says. He says over in verse 10, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself. We could nail this down and really talk about what it means to confess Christ publicly. Remember what Matthew chapter 10 said? If you do not confess me before men, I will not confess you before my Father which is in heaven. We could really nail this down. And I'm glad to be going through this, because this gives you and me an opportunity to understand how important not only is being a noble debater, where the stakes get higher, other than the kind of Twitter, Facebook crap that we all have to deal with, or the informal context in which you're arguing with people on the street where there's no real consequences, right? In the culture in which we live, there is so much low resonance dialogue and conversation and argumentation. You can walk away from some fool who's making all kind of accusations against you, and you don't have to feel like if you retort or respond to them that it's going to take you to some kind of legal threat. But in this context, it does. In this context, to answer again, apologia, to respond, give an answer, can take you to a legal threat. Now, you know we're going there as a country. Are we going there? You know that if you are aware of the fact that they're framing language now, that if they can put force under these policies for you and I to oppose the stated narrative, can put you and I in the same precarious situation. And we would have to be able to ask the question, do we have that same grace that Paul does to be ready to give an answer cheerfully? Let me go on. Because that thou mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem for to worship. Now, what is Paul doing in verse 11? He's giving Felix a time frame. He's contextualizing a time frame. You guys with me? He's helping Felix understand the parameters of time that constitutes this conflict that occurred. He's in order, dealing with it contextually. Now watch what he says. He says, and they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither raising up the people, neither in the synagogue, nor in the city. Do you see what he does? He categorically denies being a pestilent fellow. Did that come home? He categorically denies that. Now, he was in the temple. He was worshiping. We could go back to the text. It's explicit. He had 4 men there. They were all actually operating according to the law, which becomes another kind of debate that I used to be in many, many years ago as to whether or not it was right or wrong for Paul to shave his head, take a vow, and enter into the temple, having known the gospel and the finished work of Christ. Does that make some sense? And I remember these debates among the Sovereign Grace Brethren and the Reformed Brethren many, many years ago. And some of them would say that Paul was wrong for doing what he did. And others would say, no, he's not wrong. He was becoming all things to all men. He had the flexibility to actually enter into that modality because he understood that that modality didn't have teeth anymore. Did anybody get what I just stated? It didn't have teeth to condemn the believer because he's moving them through that. Besides, if you guys recall, it was James and Peter and John who told Paul to make that concession. These are pillars in the church, aren't they? So, I mean, we could sit here for quite a while and talk through how you respect your fellow peers and you work with them to quell any potential conflict. Because remember, Paul comes into the temple after 15 years. He done already stirred up all kind of mess with the Jews at Jerusalem. And when they heard that he came, they came to the temple with a vengeance. And they are making assertions about Paul that are not true. Okay? Paul did exactly what the apostles told him to do. Hey, Paul, honor Torah, okay? This is not your salvation. Just honor Torah, okay? Let's not make this more difficult than it would be. They were intuitively right because they knew that the Jews were coming. Does that make some sense, ladies and gentlemen? Right. Understanding ethical flexibility in any choice making is absolutely critical. You got to operate out of principles that are rooted at a higher ethic, like love, right? And what would be the minimal consequence out of the choices that you make? Does that make some sense? All right, so I'll leave that there for now. We can talk about it in the Q&A if you want to. Let me go on. Notice what it says in verse 13 once again. Neither can they prove the things whereof they now do what? All right, there it is. Paul is letting Felix know, this is what I did. This is where I did it. This is what they said. None of what they said they can prove. You're in a pretty good position when you make that opening argument, don't you? Now notice what he goes on to say. But this I will confess unto thee, that after the way in which they call heresy, sectarianism, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. And I have hope towards God, which they themselves also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. I shouldn't stop here, but this is such a beautiful tactic that Paul is employing, because he's actually drilling down into the grounds for the gospel. He's drilling down into the grounds for the gospel by taking their allegations, proving that what he did was out of an understanding of the doctrine of the resurrection, which the more studious portions of the Jewish people believed. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection. So what Paul is not doing is losing an opportunity while he's debating his foes to bring to this Gentile the actual pinnacle of the hope of the believer. Does that make some sense, you guys? And what is the hope of the believer? The resurrection. This is a beautiful truth. So he's getting ready to tie some concepts together. And this is what we call the continuity of the law and the gospel. So when you're dealing with law and gospel, you're dealing with two systems, are we not? I just stated it, law and gospel. So in law and gospel, you have antithesis or contradictions. That's what makes them different. But you also have continuity, parallels, complementarian overlaps. Would that make some sense? Right? On the one hand, the law condemns you of sin. On the other hand, the law is that which honors God. On the one hand, the law separates you from God because the wages of sin is what? On the other hand, because of Jesus Christ, the law now is honored and accrues to you the benefits of its righteousness because of your mediator. So there is a dichotomy and a continuity in the law gospel. That's the way your Reformed history would constantly employ the law. Just by the way, letting you know, like if you don't have a lot of history in Reformation theology or Protestantism, if you're just evangelical, most of our evangelical churches have operated out of an antithesis between law and gospel. And so most of the time, they don't even look at the Old Testament. Like if you would really listen to John MacArthur's teachings over the years, all he almost ever does is teach out of the New Testament. Because he doesn't know how to do what the reformers have done, demonstrate the continuity of Christ, both in the Old and the New. To demonstrate the gospel in the Old Testament. So what we say is the Old Testament is the New Testament what? Concealed. The New Testament is the Old Testament what? Revealed. And that axiom is only true if you can see Jesus coming in the volume of the book. So I can preach out of the Judges, right? And make a very clear Christocentric argument and its applications to us. And you can see it. Can you see it? But if we made a hard, fast dichotomy, separation between law and gospel, you couldn't see the gospel in the Old Testament. How many of you guys have grown up in a situation where reading the Old Testament because you did not understand the integrating principle of the person of Christ? You could never see the gospel in the Old Testament. Am I making sense? Totally. The gospel is the mechanism by which you see the mystery of Christ in the Old Testament. Well, this is what Paul is doing because he knows the audience that he is about to really have to deal with will be the Jewish rulers who largely still hold to Torah in terms of the conservative group. So look at verse 16, because I want to make my way down through verse 22, and then we're going to do a little bit of analysis of the fact that is about to show up pretty quickly. Verse 16, and herein do I exercise myself to always have a conscience void of offense toward God and what? All right, so there you go. That's another axiom, ladies and gentlemen, of being a noble debater. Your job and mine is try to be what? Offensive. Non-offensive in terms of who? God and who? Right. Now, when we talk about non-offensive here, we're not talking about compromising the gospel to make people feel good. We're talking about non-offensive in the sense that if someone charges you with something, that it has to reach the level of a gospel significance for you to be legitimately offensive. Like, you will be offended if I tell you that there's only one God and you are a polytheist. You are going to be offended if I tell you that there's no other name under heaven by which we must be saved but the name of Jesus Christ, if you believe that all ways lead to God. So that's not what Paul meant when he says, I try not to offend man or God. What he is really saying is I try to stay within the parameters of biblical truth as my authority, so that by and large, I'm not legitimately guilty of some allegation outside of the parameters that God has called me to. Does that make some sense? Good, very good, because otherwise it would be impossible for us to live in the world not offending people. It goes on to say, verse 17. Now, after many years, I came to bring alms to my nation and offerings. How many years? How many? So if I go, how many years, and you go many, that's not an answer. That's a tautological retort that doesn't expand anything. You know that, right? So that's like if I ask you what a tree is, you go, a tree is a tree. We haven't said anything. We haven't advanced any clarity. How many years? Does anybody know? 15 in Galatians chapter 2, verse 1. Look at Galatians 2:1. And then I think actually it's 18 years. So look at Galatians 2:1, because Paul is done. He says, then 14 years after I went up to Jerusalem. Do you guys see that? That's where he got in trouble. This is why he's in the court situation now. So according to the book of Galatians, 14 years after what? Well, in the previous chapter, 3.5 years hanging out, getting his gospel right. So if you take 14 years plus 3.5 years, how many years is that? 17.5, almost 18 years. After many years. So this is really interesting because what Paul is doing now, he's being providentially led to Rome after having been given freedom by God to sow the gospel in all of these Gentile churches. You guys keeping up with me? I'm looking at the way God is working through Paul, because remember, the Apostle Paul had to leave Jewry early on because they weren't receiving him. Remember Acts 13? He took the disciples, separated from them. He kicked the dust off his feet. He says, lo, we now go where? To the Gentiles. That's Acts 13. Acts 13, verse 48. Acts 13:44. Go there for a second. Just want to give you guys the historiography as we get ready to move on. I just want you to appreciate Paul's journey. We're probably now, and I believe we're in the second or third missionary journey. Okay, yeah. Now listen to this. And the next Sabbath day came almost the whole city together to do what? That's Jews and Gentiles. This is remarkable and unprecedented. But why are they coming? Because the Gentiles have heard Paul and the Jews have heard that the Gentiles have heard Paul. That's not good, is it? So look at the next verse, verse 45. But when the Jews saw that the multitudes, they were what? Filled with joy. And spake against those things which were spoken by Paul, doing what? Ladies and gentlemen, this is beast 2. Religion. Right? This is beast 2, religion. Notice what it goes on to say. Then Paul and Barnabas waxed bold and said it was necessary that the word of God should have first been spoken to you, but seeing you put it far away from you and judge yourselves unworthy of eternal life, lo, we turn what? It was from that point all the way up to where we are that Paul now begins to do his ministry in Asia Minor. He moves up north. He goes into Asia Minor. The 7 churches, and then it was probably about 12 or 15, Corinth, Athens, Galatia, Ephesus, Philippi, Colossae, all those. So he's doing that. So imagine from Acts 13 to where we are now, Acts 24, right? 18 years of work. Does that come home? Good. So Paul's a lot older, a lot wiser, a lot more mature. And think about this. He was exiled from Jerusalem by the gospel. He was exiled. He loves Jerusalem. Does he love Jerusalem? But he can't go back because they will kill him Secondly, he can't go back because God won't allow him to go back. He can't go back because he must establish the gospel among the Gentiles. Now he goes back. And as soon as he goes back, remember Acts 19? The church at Ephesus? Agabus comes to him, bound in a girdle, said the man that's bound, this girdle represents the one that owns it. He will be bound by the Jews once he gets to Jerusalem. And remember, they were saying to him at Ephesus, we don't want you to go. And Paul says, I'm not only ready to go, I'm ready to die. This is the context for where we are. This also is what I remember many years ago as I was listening to my Sovereign Grace brethren and my Reformed brethren arguing. Here's another one they argued. Should Paul have went to Rome? Since Agabus comes by prophecy and says to him, the man that wears this girdle is going to be bound and taken to Rome. Here he has a warning. So this is where we get into what is called conditional prophecy and unconditional prophecy. Prophecy that tells you what the future is going to be like if you take a certain path. And then there's prophecy. It does not matter what you do, you're going to do it. Does that make some sense? Right. These are the questions that came up. So some men would say he should have never went. Now, I know that may seem ridiculous to you, but there are all kind of arguments around it. It's not ridiculous to me that men of scholarly status would have thought if Paul wanted to avoid going to prison and being persecuted and being beat down, and ultimately, what does Paul experience? Beheading. Then just don't go to Jerusalem. I can see that. Can you see that argument? Can you see a wife saying that? Can you see the children saying that? I'm just trying to help you guys massage complex theories and not so easily blow them away, because over the years in my calling, I've seen these kind of arguments at levels that I go, this is not as easy as it looks. You make a choice to go down a path, you're going to hurt a lot of people in a good or bad way. But see, the thing that we love about Paul is he was married. He's no longer married. That means he can give himself totally to the Lord, right? He was a Pharisee. That's what the text just said. If he was a Pharisee, we know traditionally the Pharisees were what? Married. So his wife had to die. And there had to be no children. Am I making some sense? He was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He said that in Galatia. So he knew marriage and he knew the single status, didn't he? And so God used him in the single status because he knew there was no room for him to be a domestic keeper of the home, love a wife and love children, with him being the target and bullseye of the gospel. Does this stuff make sense that I'm sharing with you? All right, let's keep going. I definitely want to make room for some Q&A. It goes on to say here in verse 19 in our text, well, verse 17, now after many years I came to bring alms to my nation and offerings. Do you guys remember that in the book of Corinth? 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, what Paul was saying is we need alms for our Jewish brethren. That's 1 and 2 Corinthians. And they were encouraged to give for the poor brethren at Jerusalem. Did anybody remember that? That's 1 Corinthians 8 and 9, 2 Corinthians 9. That we were to gather our funds together and then to use it to help the poor brethren at Jerusalem. So Paul went to Jerusalem to help out the poor saints. Remember what his argument was? That the apostles gave him the right hand of the gospel, Peter, James, and John, and they were ministers to the circumcision. They gave Paul and Barnabas the right hand of the gospel, Galatians 2, and they said, but remember the poor among your Jewish brethren. Did anybody remember that? No, you don't. Galatians chapter 2. So let me help you right quick, because I want you to see this ethic. Because Jesus actually echoed this too. And this was framed, and this is the way the Gentile churches got taught to be charitable with giving. Giving ministry started here as a paradigm. This would be Galatians chapter 2. And then if you found it, you can call it out, because I haven't been there for a while, but I know it's there. Galatians chapter 2, where Paul receives the right hand of fellowship from the brethren. Let's see here. Yes. Here it is, verse 9. We're going to start verse 9. And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived, this is Galatians 2, perceived that the grace that was given unto me, they gave to me and Barnabas the what? And that we should go unto the heathen, and they of the circumcision. Here it is, verse 10. Only that we would what? Remember the poor, the same which I also was forward to do. And the poor he was talking about was not the poor Gentiles. It was the poor Jews. So contextually at that time, I was sharing with you guys during this whole COVID oppression that the instability of our culture right now, and it's really unstable on a lot of levels, right? You guys do know that. It's more stable than it was in the first century, because the optic I gave you was that in the first century, where the Roman Empire is ruling, that the stone cut out without hands, Daniel chapter 2:34, you guys have that optic, crush the whole image at the what? At the feet. That means it crushed it in what era? The Roman Empire. You guys with me? So the Roman Empire is the era in which the stone cut out without hands, which is who? Right. Is now working against Rome via the gospel. And Rome is coming down. Babylon, Medo-Persia, the Grecian kingdom is coming down, is breaking down under the ministry of the word of God. And as I was sharing with you on Sunday, which is so critically important for you and I to get, Jesus did his work on earth, but his work was exclusively in Jerusalem. It was not in Rome. It was not in Asia Minor. It was not in Samaria. Well, it was in Samaria, but his work didn't spread until he sent the Holy Ghost and used Peter, James, and John and the early church to spread the message of that stone. And remember how we saw that stone did what? It grew. Y'all keeping up with me, or am I the only one reading the Bible? Do y'all remember that stone growing? So remember I told you, Peter called it what kind of stone? A living stone. So that's the paradoxical nature of the stone. We are identified as stones, are we not? In the temple of God. It's a living temple growing because we have the DNA of Christ. Christ is a stone and we are stones in him, even as Peter was. So there you go. You see it. Verse 35. This affirms the stone part. I didn't mean to diverse. Was there of the summer threshing floor. Remember, a picture is as a what? Right, so you get in this little language here the complete consummation of the four. Right. Has that happened yet? Right, so you can say no or yes or no, it doesn't matter. Because really what I'm penetrating into was our four views of eschatology. The historic view of amillennialism, postmillennialism, historic millennialism, and premillennial dispensationalism. Remember we dealt with that a couple weeks ago? And I was saying that all those views have some strengths and some weaknesses. The fundamental argument is between a view of things having already been done, that's called a preterist view, over with at AD 70, or a historic view, which is what I hold, an idealist view, that things are fading away throughout